Like in so many of my other videos, I have been cross-referencing some rules from the various books of D&D, specifically looking at ability skill checks. And the language I keep coming back to is this. For every ability check, the GM decides the difficulty of the task. That portion is followed shortly after by this chart, which indicates that a task with a difficulty class, or DC, of 10 is easy to do. Easy. And as someone who strives to marry narrative storytelling with gameplay mechanics, I have to close my rulebook there, because I know exactly what's lurking just a few pages down: wisdom checks. Specifically, within the medicine ability, a wisdom check lets you try to stabilize a dying companion. You see, of all the named examples for ability checks, stabilizing a dying creature is arguably the most important check. In fact, stabilization is one of the only ability checks to be granted its own rules section in the combat section of the basic rules. And it's that specification, that rules section, that I want to examine in the context of the rest of the rules surrounding ability checks and difficulty classes. Make no mistake, the ruling for stabilization is extremely important. It's literally life and death. Well, life and death saving throws, which lead to death, but you get my point. Using an action to invoke a medicine check, you can administer care to an unconscious creature with 0 hit points. On a success, the creature is quote-unquote stable. It remains unconscious, but it stops making death saving throws unless or until it takes damage. While stabilization is unique in its importance, it's still just an ability check. It's referred to as such throughout the basic rules and the Dungeon Master's Guide, and from everything I've seen, it follows the same rules as all other ability checks. Which means, well, before I continue any further, I want to note something. All tabletop games are based on consent. No player should enter a game without having a clear understanding of the rules of that game. This is why I've always advocated for a comprehensive session 0 or a set of guidelines that make clear to the GM and the players what they can expect. If you want to set all of your stabilization checks at 10 DC, more power to you. However, the rules do not require you to set your DC at 10 for all stabilization checks. You're picturing it now, right? Your friend, your ally, they're pierced by an arrow, pitched into the air by an unfeeling, unthinking monstrosity. They lay lifeless on the battlefield, energy draining away from them with every second. Although you know little about medicine, you fumble with what little supplies you have in your kit to staunch the river of blood that pours from the wound. You look at the dice and you add your modifiers, total 11. You breathe easily. But then you look at your DM. She's shaking her head. You failed the stabilization check. I believe, rules as written, you can make the DC for a medicine check higher or lower if you want to for stabilizing a creature. Thinking about it, a DC 10 check is easy to accomplish. Rules as written, easy tasks should have about a 50% chance of success if you aren't proficient at all in the associated skill. I'm not suggesting that stabilization means you're resuscitating or healing a creature, but certainly keeping a creature from dying in most contexts is not or should not be easy. This is especially true if the context in which you are stabilizing a creature is, amid combat. It's important to recognize that the rules don't account for every possible situation that might arise during a typical D&D session. For that reason, it's often up to the DM to determine the appropriateness of a check. And I hear some of you. In D&D, specific rules trump general rules. Aren't we bound then to keep the 10 DC because it's noted specifically? Well, no. The Dungeon Master's Guide specifically states that you can change established DCs. There are an infinite number of factors that can affect the difficulty of a task, not just of stabilization, but of any ability check. The environment, the amount of time to do the task, the range at which the task is done, the supplies you have to do the task, your experience, etc., etc. Let's take range, for example. User Jacob Dobero, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, had asked my thoughts on a question that can be put like this. Since stabilization does not include a range, does that mean that the range is unlimited? Can I stabilize a creature from, say, 100 feet away? To quote a more experienced DM, you can certainly try. I believe that there is no range limitation on any ability check because, well, the rules don't account for everything. So maybe there's a world, a scenario, in which you shoot healing arrows, or mage hand a bandage onto a wound, or instruct an eldritch abomination on how to give life-stabilizing CPR to another creature. I don't know. What I do know is that you would be within your rights as a DM to either require a medicine check or disallow that check. You see, sometimes the circumstances can be such that the DM, as the mediator of the rules, will have to determine what is and isn't possible. To quote the DM's guide, sometimes mediating the rules means setting limits. And it goes on to describe telling a player that their plan of action is impossible. In the ability check section of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it outright states that no matter how many checks needed, a task may still be impossible. Is a task so inappropriate or impossible that it can't work? If the answer is yes, then a roll would be inappropriate. You as the DM have the right to make that determination based on the circumstance, and if range is a circumstance you want to consider, then you can certainly rule that a range stabilization is possible or impossible. To that same extent, I think you should be able to determine the range of the DCs for a check based on the circumstances. While I used range there as an example, there are plenty of other practical reasons a check may be lower or higher than 10. Take the damage that made the creature unconscious. Some abilities or amounts of damage that reduce you to 0 hit points can outright kill you, and those damages are treated differently mechanically. So why shouldn't they be treated differently for the purposes of determining a stabilization check? Would a town guard who was knocked out by a bandit's punches be as easy to stabilize as a town guard who was immolated by the breath of a dragon? And what about player level? Should it be as easy for a level 1 character to stabilize as, say, a level 20 character? Personally, I keep the stabilization checks at 10 DC because that is what my players are used to. But while that's an assumption of most players based on the rules, I don't think that it has to be that way. In fact, I would argue that the mere concept of keeping a creature from dying should not be considered easy by any standard, mechanical, gameplay, or otherwise. But I also understand the limitations of the game and the expectations of players who have kept the DC at 10 for so long. It's in reconsidering the way that I think about this one standardized, established check that allows me to think more critically about difficulty class as a concept. I made this video to remind all DMs that you control the game. So long as your players have a clear understanding of how you intend to rule, your DCs can be effectively utilized as a tool to add, well, difficulty and excitement to your games. As I finish this video, let's return to my scenario from before. A turn goes by. A long turn. An excruciatingly long turn. Your other allies are holding back the horde and they're succeeding, but your focus isn't on that. Their battle is nearly won, but yours is still raging on. You know that there can't be many chances left. There's been 3 death saving rolls already. You don't need your ally back right now, you just need them to survive. You spent the whole turn thinking about what their death could mean, about all the choices that led up to this moment. You look at the choices on your character sheet and you see a +0 next to medicine. If only it wasn't you who was responsible for this next check. You don't know what it takes, but you know you have to roll higher than an 11. But how high? Your ally is hurt. Your friend is hurt. They are dying. And it's now or never. 15. You look up at your DM. Have you done it? Is your friend going to live? And the DM smiles.